Around 2.4 billion years ago marks the beginning of one of the greatest transformations in the history of our planet, the Great Oxidation Event, or GEO. Before this event, Earth lacked molecular oxygen, the gas in the atmosphere that we and all other animals today breathe. Now, this lack of oxygen on early Earth doesn't mean there was no life. In fact, even today, there are plenty of species of bacteria and archaea that do not require molecular oxygen to metabolize. Instead, they use other chemicals, including various forms of sulfur, nitrogen, iron, hydrogen, and methane to gain energy. And although they're restricted to the small, anoxic, or oxygen-lacking corners of the world today, before the GEO, the world belonged to them. Then, all of a sudden, from around 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, atmospheric molecular oxygen began accumulating for the first time following the evolution and spread of oxygen-producing photosynthesizing bacteria. Now, there are some complexities in that story that I'm skipping over, like the almost billion-year gap between the evolution of oxygen-producing photosynthesizers and the GEO, which was due to chemical sinks that prevented free oxygen from building up initially. In other words, any oxygen that was produced had to first react with any readily available chemicals like reduced iron before it could build up on its own. This is how we got deposits like huge banded iron formations, or BIFs. And there are, of course, many other chemicals it was reacting with, but for this video, we'll be focusing on how we know the timing of the GEO. There are several lines of evidence in the rock record that corroborate the timing, duration, and magnitude of this global rise in oxygen, including the photosynthetic bacterial mats, or stromatolites, the depositional patterns of BIFs throughout this interval, other deposits like red beds and detrital pyrite, and a whole suite of oxygen-sensitive geochemical proxies or signatures. But the smoking gun, per se, is, I believe, the most underrated piece of evidence we have. Essentially, there is a specific type of sulfur isotope signal preserved in Earth rocks older than 2.4 billion years, but this signal disappears in all rocks younger than 2.4 billion years. And it took some time for geoscientists to figure out exactly what this meant, but it turns out the disappearance of this signal is directly related to the absence of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere before the GEO and the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere ever since the GEO. But to understand why, we first have to go over some isotope basics. As you probably know, atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. The number of protons is what defines the element. So if the number of protons changes, the element changes. But the number of neutrons defines the isotope. If the number of neutrons changes, the isotope changes. Now, some combinations of protons and neutrons are unstable, meaning that their nuclei naturally fall apart or decay over time, transforming into entirely different elements. Those are radioactive isotopes, which we use for radiometric dating or determining the age of rocks. For example, uranium decaying into lead or carbon-14 decaying into nitrogen, etc. The sulfur isotopes that we'll talk about today are not radioactive. They are what we call stable isotopes, meaning that they do not decay over time. So instead of acting like clocks that tell us when a rock formed, stable isotopes act more like chemical fingerprints. They record information about the physical, chemical, and biological processes that affected the isotopes during their journey through different systems on Earth. I always like to say that stable isotopes don't tell us the age of a rock, but they tell us the story of the rock. Sulfur has 4 naturally occurring stable isotopes: sulfur-32, sulfur-33, sulfur-34, and sulfur-36. These numbers represent the number of protons plus neutrons in the isotope. Sulfur-32 has 16 protons and 16 neutrons, sulfur-33 has 16 protons and 17 neutrons, and so on. And importantly, as the number of neutrons changes, the mass changes. Chemically, these isotopes are all still sulfur, so they behave almost identically. The only real difference is their mass. And you may be wondering, would the mass of 1 or 2 neutrons really make a noticeable difference? But turns out, yeah, across billions of atoms and countless reactions, that tiny mass difference makes all the difference. Okay, but why would rocks contain different amounts of sulfur isotopes? How is rock formation dependent on isotope mass? This answer comes down to physics. Because sulfur-32 weighs slightly less than sulfur-34, those atoms move slightly faster. Their chemical bonds vibrate just a little differently, and in many reactions, they're just a little easier to move around than the heavier isotopes. These differences are small when comparing one isotope to another, but geological processes move billions of atoms over hundreds of millions of years, amplifying these differences. And as a result, different chemical reservoirs, the atmosphere, oceans, rocks, and life itself, gradually become enriched in either the lighter or heavier isotopes. This process is called isotope fractionation. An example of a natural sulfur isotope fractionation process is seen in sulfate-reducing bacteria. These bacteria take up sulfate and use it in a similar way to how we use oxygen to gain energy. And the byproduct they produce is hydrogen sulfide. And because they preferentially take up sulfate-containing lighter sulfur isotopes, their sulfide byproducts become isotopically lighter than the initial pool of sulfate in that system. Over time, this can lead to light isotope signatures preserved in sulfide minerals in the rock record, which can help us reconstruct periods of enhanced bacterial sulfur cycling in Earth's past. And such periods may indicate some sort of change in overall ocean chemistry, climate, etc. But here's where we get to the really important part. Almost every process that fractionates isotopes does so according to one rule. The amount of fractionation depends on the mass difference between the isotopes. Hence why we call it mass-dependent fractionation. So when geologists measure the isotope composition of a rock, they don't simply look at how much sulfur-34 this rock contains, they compare one isotope to another. For sulfur, the most common measurement is the ratio between sulfur-34 and sulfur-32. Because sulfur can make up different percentages of different rocks, simply measuring how much sulfur-34 is present wouldn't tell us much, but the ratio of sulfur-34 to 32 preserves the chemical history of the sulfur itself. So we take that ratio, compare it to a standard, and there you have the isotope composition. We have to do this standardization step because think of it like comparing temperatures. If I tell you today's temperature is 82 degrees, that number only has meaning because we have a reference scale. Isotope measurements are the same. They only become meaningful when we compare them against an internationally agreed upon standard. And we report this isotope composition as a delta value. So for sulfur, you'll often see the notation delta 34S, which essentially indicates the ratio of 34 to 32 in a rock. And because it's compared to a standard, a positive delta 34S value indicates that the sample contains proportionally more sulfur-34 than the standard, and a negative value means it contains proportionally less. You'll also notice that the isotope composition values are written in per mil notation, shown with a symbol that looks like percent, but with an extra tiny O at the bottom right. This is just like a percent, except instead of meaning out of every 100, it means out of every 1,000. Geochemists just use this because the isotope differences we're measuring tend to be incredibly small, and per mil turns these tiny decimal differences into numbers that are much easier to read and compare. Okay, now on to the fun stuff. Isotope composition isn't the only way we measure stable isotopes in a rock. We can also measure isotope offset. So what's the difference? Well, remember that sulfur doesn't just have 2 stable isotopes. It has 4, 32, 33, 34, and 36. That means we can measure several different isotope ratios, like 33 to 32, 34 to 32, 36 to 32, and each of these can be reported as its own delta value. And because the only difference between these isotopes is mass, and we know the exact amount of mass difference, 1 atomic mass unit for every neutron, we should be able to predict all 3 of these values even if we only measure 1. For example, let's take the sulfur-34 to 32 and 33 to 32 ratios. Because there's a difference of 2 mass units between 34 and 32, and only 1 mass unit between 33 and 32, the value of the sulfur-34 to 32 ratio should be twice that of the 33 to 32 ratio. In other words, if we take the 33 to 32 ratio and subtract the 34 to 32 ratio divided by 2, we should get 0. And this is isotope offset, which is denoted with a capital delta. This works because all sulfur isotopes respond to fractionation together in a predictable way. So why would we ever measure this offset value if it should always equal 0? Well, it's often a good way to double check our measurements, make sure our equipment's behaving, and oh, wait a second, what's that? Oh yeah, it can sometimes also end up being the key evidence for one of the most transformative events in Earth's history. Okay, what's going on here? Why are these sulfur isotope values not behaving the way they normally should? Well, remember our rule of thumb. The isotope offset value should always be equal to 0, as long as the isotopes are fractionating solely based on mass. So clearly something was fractionating these sulfur isotopes independently of their mass, which is why we call this mass-independent fractionation. And if we look at the timing, we notice that the switch from mass-independent fractionation to mass-dependent fractionation of sulfur isotopes occurs right around 2.4 billion years ago. So the obvious question becomes, what was happening before 2.4 billion years ago that caused sulfur isotopes to deviate from typical stable isotope behavior? And what changed right around 2.4 billion years ago to cause them to start behaving typically? Well, the answer does not lie in rocks or the ocean, but high in Earth's atmosphere. Before the Great Oxidation event, Earth's atmosphere contained almost no free oxygen, and because ozone is made from oxygen, the ozone layer had yet to develop. This meant that high-energy UV radiation could penetrate way deeper into Earth's atmosphere than it can today. At the same time, volcanoes were constantly releasing sulfur-bearing gases, especially sulfur dioxide, into the atmosphere, and when that high-energy UV radiation struck these sulfur gases, it triggered a series of photochemical reactions that, unlike every other chemical reaction that sulfur undergoes naturally on Earth today, did not fractionate the isotopes simply according to their mass, but instead fractionated the sulfur mass independently, creating this so-called mass-independent fractionation, or MIF, signal. And after atmospheric oxygen accumulated and the ozone layer formed, blocking this high-energy UV radiation, the sulfur isotope MIF signal virtually disappears. Not because the sulfur or the rocks changed, but because Earth's atmosphere did. And that's why this is considered one of the strongest and most direct pieces of evidence for the Great Oxidation event. It's also extremely powerful because it's not merely evidence that oxygen existed locally on Earth at the time, it's evidence that oxygen had accumulated enough to form a somewhat global ozone layer by that time. There are certain signatures preserved in the rock record before 2.4 billion years ago that indicate potential whiffs or localized oases of oxygen prior to the GEO. So to have both those kind of localized oases, pieces of evidence before the GEO, and then to have the MIF signal indicating the timing of when atmospheric oxygen permanently accumulated beyond a certain threshold in the atmosphere, at least to form ozone and block certain UV rays, that is huge for forming this, full picture of oxygen evolution on early Earth. And another thing that makes the MIF signal so powerful is that its sustained disappearance indicates that oxygen not only crossed this threshold at a planetary atmospheric scale, but also that it persisted above that threshold beyond the initial jump in oxygen concentrations. Because there have been, hypotheses that the GEO marked a rise in oxygen, but then it kind of rebounded back down, which is still possible, but it certainly didn't rebound so far that the MIF signal came back or anything. So anyway, the MIF signal is the coolest piece of evidence, I think, that we have for the GEO, and just so underrated and not talked about, and I don't know why, because it's so cool. I mean, I do know why. It's got isotopes involved, and so nobody talks about it. But that's all I got for the MIF signal and how cool it is and what it has to do with GEO. And if you want to hear more about the GEO and other pieces of evidence we have for it and all that, I do have some older videos which I'll link below. But if you want me to have do a deeper dive and have an expert on or anything, let me know in the comments and I can make that happen. Bye.